Well, we are in Daniel and chapter 4, so you can go there and we're sort of catching back up. Beginning of last week, I went through sort of a summary of the chapters that we have looked at to get to chapter 4 here. And my purpose primarily was to remind you of what the Lord has done already in front of Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. And which is pretty dramatic. Now, of course, Daniel comes off of this whole timeline, and when the Lord wanted to do something in front of the eyes of the whole world with the nation of Israel, drawing them to the nation, because the nation would be through which the Messiah would arrive. And of course, the Lord is interested in having the eyes of the world see the Messiah. And he has desired this. And now, of course, he's changed plans. And he has now been working, as we've been watching, in Daniel and his buddies' lives in a very dramatic way. And what we get to witness when we're working through Daniel is sort of the perspective of one of the targets, if you would, of that testimony. This individual, Daniel and his testimony, and the Lord has been raising him up, and of course he raises up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, but he raises them up in prominence in front of the eyes of the Babylonians, in particular in front of the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's fairly dramatic. As I mentioned last week as well, there's not many people that get this many opportunities to see God's power manifested right in front of their face to this extent. We see God's creation every day, we take it for granted, right, unfortunately. But there are times when God works in your life and around you where it is so dramatic. Of course, this is only God doing something right now. And those are usually more rare than common. But in this book of Daniel, God has been doing quite a few things in front of Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. I reminded you of some of those, and I'll go over this just briefly. But in Daniel chapter 1, that's when all the boys arrive in Babylon. And I reminded you that it was in front of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the one that called all these young guys in, and then he sort of did a pop quiz. And he started asking them questions, and it was right then that he realized that these guys, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, these were 10 times above everyone else. God had raised these guys up in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes already at the very first meeting, if you would. They had been brought in from Jerusalem. In Daniel chapter 2, of course, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. I don't have to remind you much on that one, because we know he has a dream, he doesn't tell anybody, he says, you tell me or you're all dead, kind of thing. And then Daniel comes in and he does exactly what Nebuchadnezzar's asking. And if anybody knows, that the truth is coming out and it's supernatural power that's revealing it, it's Nebuchadnezzar. Because he knows he hasn't told anybody. Do you know what somebody else could say? By the way, do you know that God is interesting, because he always leaves a way that you could misinterpret what he's done if you want to. That is, with your will and your flesh and all this. Do you know what somebody else could say? I bet Nebuchadnezzar told him the dream. Mm-hmm. That's how I make myself feel better, because I could know it, right? But if I just tell myself, well, he probably told him. He didn't tell us that he told him, but I bet he told him. I bet he told him what it was. I don't know. We can lie to ourselves to get out of conviction. But anyways, regardless, Nebuchadnezzar, of anybody on the planet right there, knew that it was God dealing through Daniel with him. And of course, these words came out in, I didn't read the ones of Daniel because he just exclaims how these guys are 10 times better than everybody else, but in chapter 2, it is Nebuchadnezzar that he fell on his face, he worshipped that, he commanded that they should offer oblations, sweet odors, and so forth. The king answered Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is God of gods. Hey, wait. We are just doing a catch-up to chapter 4 of Daniel. And the king answered unto Daniel, said, of a truth it is that your God is God of gods and Lord of lords and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. He's got it. Who that? Nebuchadnezzar is God. He's already had the testimony previously of these guys in front of him. He knows that there's something special about these guys. God did that in front of Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's done this in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And it goes on into Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the time, space, and the difference here. But this is when, chapter 3 is when Nebuchadnezzar does the big idol thing, right? This big statue, gold head, silver, all the way bronze, all the way down, right? Does that whole thing. And then he says, bow down or you get tossed in the fire. So what happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They throw it into the fire. And then what? Now God is again right in front of Nebuchadnezzar in his own eyes and with his own words and he's going to proclaim again. He sees the power of the God of the Hebrews, right? By the way, he just sort of considers him one of the gods, right? He's just one of many, according to him. But Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, they know better. Here in chapter 3, verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, delivered his servants, trusted in him, and has changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language who speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. There's incentive, right? Now he's not saying you have to only worship the God of the Hebrews. That's not what he's saying. He's just saying you don't say anything against them because they've proved themselves. He's proved himself to me. That God has, right? So just don't say anything against that God because I know better. And, if you have problems doing that, I'll give you some more incentive. I'll cut you to pieces. Okay? Right? So he gets his point across. But he's very convinced. It's very interesting. He's very convinced that the Hebrews have an absolutely powerful God. He's convinced. He's not convinced that it is the only God. There's more coming. But he's not convinced of that. Now, and then we come into Daniel chapter 4, and now Daniel chapter 4 is written very uniquely in that it is now a letter written by Nebuchadnezzar about his second dream. Many, many years later. So here's, I'm going to build up on the timeline again. And this is where, again, because of the historical record now being recorded by more nations, right, in different forms, but like with the Babylonians, you guys have heard of those stones, those sort of cylindrical stones that they had writing on the whole thing, and you could just sort of roll it out, kind of thing. Well, that was these Babylonians, right? They were already keeping pretty serious records. And so when you look back at the historians, they don't debate the dates anymore because they're settled. They know what date things happen. And so the date 605 shows up again and again when you start looking at this timeline in terms of with Daniel and so forth, because it was in 605 when Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem the first time, sort of, and said, we're going to take some of you guys to Babylon. That's when Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel were taken. I'll take the first, Second Kings in a little bit, just to refresh some of that stuff. But that's when that occurred. Now, we are in Daniel chapter 4. This is that second dream. We are now, let's see here, make sure I get this right. This is 40 years after 40 years after the first dream that he had, Nebuchadnezzar. It's quite a period of time. Now, and I'll show you how they figure some of this stuff out, I think. But regardless, there's a good period of time that has passed. Now remember, I read a bit in chapter 4, and maybe I'll just do that a little bit here, just to start this off again. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king unto all the people. It's Nebuchadnezzar's text that's being presented here to the people. Unto all the people, nations, and language that dwell in all the earth. Who's he talking to? He just told you. Okay, he's not talking to a few people, his counselors, or his wife or wives. He is writing this letter to everyone who better listen. Right? He's not in that mind frame that you can listen if you want to. That's not what he does. He's writing to everyone on the earth. You get that? He's writing a letter to everyone on the whole planet. Why? Because he runs the show. That is the earthly show. This is the mindset of this Nebuchadnezzar. Right? He knows that he owns the world, so to speak, from a human political, geopolitical perspective. He's got it, he's running it. He is the king, if you would, of all the nations. Now, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. He thought this would be a good idea. Right? Why? Well, when you read through, you figure out why. Because he's been put in his place. By the end of this chapter, you find out that he's been put in place. In what place? Think of yourself no higher than you ought, no lower than you ought, kind of thing. God has put him exactly, he has showed him where he is in the lineup. And he realizes that if he's going to come to realize that unless God gave him the power, he would have zero. Just like Jesus standing in front of Pilate said, if God didn't give you, you would have no power. That is exactly what Nebuchadnezzar has come to realize in this thing. And he goes on, verse 3, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. He's going to spew out truth after truth after truth. Now, who Nebuchadnezzar is? Who's he writing to?
All of us.
The whole world. Agatha, you had your hand.
I was just going to say, like when Nebuchadnezzar never realized that when he said to all the earth that today we are still reading it, and it still is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And he had no idea what he was talking about.
No, he's preaching. He's preaching. Now, remember, the time here, this is 40 years on. Okay? He's had 40 years, and God has revealed himself in pretty powerful ways. But it was this last little stint that really took impact. I don't know, and I actually didn't ask this question, maybe I should look into this before I say this, but it seems to me that by the end of this chapter, there's actually a change of heart going on in Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know that for sure, but it seems like something has gone on. Now, that said, he's going to go on and just say, I saw, verse 5, saw in a dream, he's dreaming, made me afraid, the thoughts of my bed. That was similar to that 40 years ago kind of dream. Therefore I made a decree, verse 6, to bring all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, they couldn't do it. Verse 8, interesting. But at the last, he calls Daniel. Now I asked this question last time, I'll ask it again. Why would you call Daniel last when you know what you know about Daniel and dreams? Why would you call him last? Now,
you're actually offended by his God.
you know,
You are overpowered.
something, over the period of time, I agree, something, he's let it slip. But we're guilty of this as human beings. God can do something absolutely dramatic in your life. You know it's God. You know it's nobody else but God, and then you get into trouble somewhere in your life, and then you go to everybody else first.
It reminds me of the verse in 2 Chronicles 16, verse 12.
Okay?
What was it? Asaph, when he was afflicted with a disease in
His feet, yeah.
and he looked for doctor's help before he
Yes.
went to the Lord, and then
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, but we're dummies. I'm sorry. You know, God's very diplomatic the way he says it, but you're a bunch of dummies. We are a bunch of dummies. You're dummies. I gotta treat you like that. You're not that bright. Or your brightness is dimmed by your flesh, right? You know better. Don't you know better? Doesn't he know better? Oh goodness, of course he knows better. Don't we know better? We know better. Brian.
You don't know that God is all you need until God is all you have. So you don't know that.
Yes.
Yet we do know that.
Yeah, we do know it. We
know
just
that.
don't do it. We do not do it. You know, how many, God, he probably can't get a stiff neck, but he must get, like shaking his head going, I can't believe they're doing that again. I cannot believe it. I can't believe it. Or rolling his eyes. Oh, goodness, right? Again. I want to do this for you. Come with me to, just so we get a fuller sense of the whole context, which I like. Come to 2 Kings. We talked about this in the past, but do you remember, amazing this thing is still up actually. The makeshift. Do you remember where we are? King Josiah was that last good king, right? And he reigned 31 years, and he had a bunch of sons. Now, his sons are the ones that are going to be reigning after him, and they're going to hop around here. Jehoahaz is the first one, Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiakim is his son. But these three guys, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, are all related to Josiah, of course. Now, the Bible, when Daniel 1 opens up, it tells you that in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim is when Nebuchadnezzar came in the first time. So, look with me, chapter 20, what did I tell you, 24? Yeah, 24 of 2 Kings. Sorry, I need to back you up to verse 36 of the previous chapter. So chapter 23 and verse 36. It says, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign. Jehoiakim, this guy. Jehoahaz has already done his 3 months. It was very short. Jehoiakim is now going to be in place. And it says he was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebudah, daughter of Pedaiah, and so forth. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Remember, all the sons afterwards were evil after Josiah. These guys were all evil kings. Now, verse 1 of chapter 24. In his days, in Jehoiakim's days, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. So he came up, and he was made subject to the Babylonians. The Egyptians were in place earlier. That's all gone because the political power has shifted. The military political power, and now the Babylonians have come in. And they have taken over. And it says, and the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees. And, oh sorry, I should have read this last part. And Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years, and then he turned and rebelled against him. So then the Bible says, the Lord sent against him bands of Chaldees and bands of the Syrians and so forth. And then it says, verse 5, now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did. So verse 6, so Jehoiakim slept with his fathers. Jehoiakim his son reigned in his stead. And this is the Jehoiakim, his son reigned in his stead. And the king of Egypt came not any more out of the land, for the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt all the way to the river Euphrates, all that pertained to the king of Egypt. And Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. That was that part. And he did that which was evil. Verse 10. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem and besieged the city. This is 605 BC. This is when Nebuchadnezzar shows up. And it says that Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother, and they gave up, kind of thing. They were carried away. And he carried, verse 14, and he carried away all Jerusalem and all the princes and all the mighty men. The princes, this is these guys. That's Daniel, these young smart guys. At least that's the way I see it with the list there. They took all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and smiths, and none remained save the poorest people of the land. That's happening here. So they're going to take the first deportation, they call it, out from Jerusalem. They are going to take them to Babylon. Verse 11, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. That was the part. Now, that's 605. The guy, Jehoiakim gets out of there, verse 17. King of Babylon made Mattaniah his father's brother king. That's this Zedekiah. He changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah is going to be he's that last king. But these guys, this is all happening when we're reading Daniel. So Daniel starts over here with chapter 1, and all this stuff is still going on with all these kings. Nebuchadnezzar is calling the shots for Jerusalem. Who's in charge? He's bouncing guys in and out, putting people in, they're puppet kings. Okay? That's what is going on. When we're reading in Daniel, as I have mentioned previously, Daniel doesn't refer to any of that that's going on back home. He's in Babylon, and all we hear from him in that book is speaking of course, he speaks prophetically where it's all going to end up. But he is very there, if you would. He is right there in the midst of where God has him, and he's doing God's work in front of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, now you can come back to, well, actually, one more thing. Go to chapter 25. This is, now years later, it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, and who are we talking about here? Zedekiah. In the 10th month, for that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came. He's coming again. Nebuchadnezzar is still reigning in Babylon. These guys are sort of a thorn in their side, if you would, that these guys are rebelling. Zedekiah is going to rebel against him as well. These are these evil kings, right? Do you remember God said, if you want to live, just go with the Babylonians. Don't fight them. Well, these guys, as smart as they are, decided to fight and rebel, right? So Zedekiah does the same thing. He rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. It says, he came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, 10th month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, pitched against it, and they built, so they fortified against it, right? They besieged the city. And the city was besieged until the 11th year of Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed, so they shut off all the food supply. There was no bread. The city was broken up, and all the men of war fled. Well, that's unfortunate now, right? And so the Chaldeans were up against the city. Verse 5, the army of the Chaldees pursued the king, overtook him in the plains of Jericho. They took, verse 6, the king, brought him up to the king of Babylon, and gave judgment upon him. And then verse 7, this is tragic, and they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Before whose eyes? Before Zedekiah's eyes, and then they put out his eyes. The last thing he saw was his sons getting killed in front of him. And then they take out his eyes. doesn't see anymore. Zedekiah doesn't. And bound him with fetters of brass and carried him to Babylon. Now, this is years into the time that Daniel's already in Babylon. He doesn't mention Zedekiah showing up at all. I don't know, he could have, but he doesn't. He's in Babylon, and where was he in power, Daniel? Pretty high up, right? He was up there in terms of with the wise guys. He doesn't bring up any of this stuff. All of this is still going on, but he sees the tragedy of it. He sees the spiraled end, downward end of Israel. He gets to hear about it. Nebuchadnezzar's gone up and besieged the city again. And now they captured Zedekiah and they killed the kids, the boys. And they took out his eyes. Now, it says, verse 8, and in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's got 19 years. He started by 605 was his first year. I believe it was his first year in power, Nebuchadnezzar. He did that his first. He was very ambitious. He hit the ground running, literally, when he came into power. Nebuchadnezzar did. And he went into Jerusalem. Now it's 19 years later. And he has taken Zedekiah and the rest of Jerusalem captive. He sort of, then he puts in a little governor in the area. But that is where, if you, coming back now to Daniel. So in 605, they say this is when Daniel was taken captive. They did 3 years of training, so it's about 602 now, when they are sort of ready to be in the palace with the king and do their stuff. And that is when Nebuchadnezzar has that first dream. That first one, right? So, which was right around that 602. We're coming now to chapter 4. It is 40 years after that first dream, now when chapter 4 opens up. I'll pause here just 1 second. So I don't know exactly where Nebuchadnezzar put up that idol to worship. Remember, he had quite an idea he was going to make himself all gold, right? In that thing. So it doesn't appear, even though it follows immediately, the next chapter is, the gold statue after chapter 2. It doesn't appear that it happened immediately after. There was 19 plus years of stuff that goes on, and now that could have occurred. I'm not exactly sure where that happened. It does happen later on, it seems like. So now we're chapter 4. And chapter 4 is the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar's. So, verse 6, chapter 4. Therefore made I a decree to bring all the wise men, and at last he brought in Daniel. Why last? But that's what he does. But at the last, now there is, of course, all this time in between. And part of our entropy, things just deteriorate over time. As you get older, that deterioration happens faster in a shorter period of time. Right? But it happens. But you can have this profound experience, if you would, this meeting with you and God, and something very amazing happens. And as time goes on, that dwindles. So some of that is explained in the time between that first dream, when he had the pretty dramatic interpretation and all that stuff, and this one. Calls him Daniel last. And he says to Daniel, and he came in whom the spirit of the holy gods is, and before him I told the dream. So he tells him the dream this time, which wasn't like the first time. And verse 9, O Belshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in me. So here you get a clue. 40 years later, right? He's not saying the only God, number one creator, that, you know, there is no other God before him kind of thing. He's just saying one of the gods, and it's little g. And in his mind, he's not very powerful because in 40 years he hasn't done it again, I guess. I don't know, but you know what I mean? He's not, it's like he's even softened in how much he respected that God of the Hebrews. He's God, he's one of them, kind of thing. But he knows that Daniel, this Belshazzar, has got the holy gods in him, he figures, and no secret trouble thee. So tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen in interpretation. So then he goes through, and I won't read it all, but this is of course the one with the tree and the leaves, right? The tree grew, it was strong, the height thereof, and the leaves were fair. Verse 13, I saw in the vision of my head upon the bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came. So he gets the picture of this absolutely majestic tree, right? It was beautiful. And then he sees some kind of holy one, a supernatural being, who's called a watcher or something, but he's got some authority, okay? And he's coming down to take a look. So, and he cried aloud, that watcher did, that holy one. Verse 14, he cried aloud and said, thus, hew down the tree, cut off the branches, shake off all the majesty, cut it down. Boom. And let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and his roots, right? Verse 16, let his heart be changed. You're getting a clue now. Whose heart? The tree's heart. Right? See, we're not talking trees. We're talking about a human being. And there's little glimpses that show up in the dream, right? Let his heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given him, and let 7 times pass over. Now, we're going to come back to that 7 times in a bit, but I used to think this was 7 years just because that seemed the most obvious, right? But it seems like it was not. It seems like it was 7 months, which was a shorter frame of time, a piece of time. It was a lunar piece of time instead of a solar piece of time, if you will. So that, but anyways, coming back in here, 7 times pass over him. And this matters by decree of the watchers. Verse 18, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, Belshazzar, declare interpretation, right? Verse 19 is Daniel steps in. Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour. And I said this last time, but this makes me chuckle because if I put myself into Nebuchadnezzar's place and I have this, dream, it freaks me out and all this stuff, and I bring in those really wise guy who's I know he can do it, and I tell him the dream, and he starts going into this deer in the headlights look for an hour. Somehow I have a feeling this isn't good news. I don't know. I would just get the sense this isn't going to be a great report. It might be, but I don't know. The more time goes on, the more nervous I would get, I think. But he goes, he's a little shaken, Daniel is, because of what he understands the dream to be and what he understands he has to do. He has to tell the guy, right? And so he was astonished for an hour, and then the king spake and said, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. You know what I gotta find this. He just told him, he said, I like what you do, and I know that nothing troubles you. I mean, it's comical, because this one troubles him, noticeably, in front of Nebuchadnezzar. So now, he's going, okay, well, I gotta tell you, Belshazzar answered and said, my lord, the dream be to them that hate thee. I wish I was telling you this to your enemies, Nebuchadnezzar, but I gotta tell it to you. But this is the kind of thing you want to hear spoken against your enemies and not against you. It would be better if I could do that. It's a very diplomatic way for Daniel to speak to the king, right? Do not shoot the messenger, please, right? So, The tree that thou sawest and grew, that's you. Whose leaves were fair, that's you. It is thou, O king, verse 22. Thou art grown and become strong, for thy greatness is grown and reached unto the heavens. I'm going to pause again. I wish, we haven't never done this yet, but to show us, do a slideshow of what they understand to have been the glory of Babylon at the time. It's just crazy. Now, it started off pretty wild. This is 40 years in. These guys have been ruling for 40 years and they've just been spending cash, which they've got tons of. They've got mountains of gold. And they're using it. They've got all the servants they need, and they're using them. And they have built this absolutely majestic earthly kingdom, if you would. And he says, you've grown strong. It's reached to heaven. Thy dominion to the end of the earth, which is why he's writing the letter to the ends of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven, saying, hew the tree down and destroy it, leave the stump, even with a band of iron brass, and the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, let his portion be with the beasts, and so forth. This is the interpretation. And this is the decree, this is verse 24 now, which is come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, the kingdom shall be sure, so it's going to stay for you. They're going to hold it for you until thee after thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. What's the purpose? It's telling them right here. This is what's going to happen to you, and this is why it's going to happen to you. Right? But he says, after this, now verse 27 is very interesting because this is Daniel's heart now coming up, and as well as, of course, the Lord's. But he says, wherefore, O king, let my counsel, Daniel saying, let my counsel sink in, right? Let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and do what? Do you know that he doesn't have to go through the beast thing? Who does not have? Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have to go through it. He doesn't have to. If it be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness. Do what's right before God. Don't keep doing what you're doing. Turn around. And he says, and thy iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. What you got now, Nebuchadnezzar, is tranquility. Tranquility would be you're in your right mind, right? And you are being able to function as a human being on this planet. And you take that for granted, along with everything else. But if you want to extend that tranquility, listen to my counsel, is what Daniel is saying. So the chapter goes on, unfortunately, this way. And all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked into the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. And the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built? That's not the words of a humble man that has recognized that God gave it all to him. Remember, this starts right at the beginning. One of the reasons that God did that first vision and all that stuff was to show him, who? Nebuchadnezzar, that God is sovereign over all of it 40 years ago. And he's repeated the lesson, if you would, along the way, but you can't even burn a guy if I don't let you. Right? You can't. I was the one that said, this plan is done. And I'm going to send you guys in, the Chaldeans, Babylonians, I'm going to send you in to spank them. 70 years. God said, I'm doing that. I'm running the show. I wrote the plan. You didn't. You think you did, but you did not, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I gotta pull back, right? Because this is our Christian walk. This is a mirror again. It's always a mirror, right? You don't write it. You don't write the show for your life. God is writing it. He's writing the story. And he wants to write yours. And when he finds resistance in Vern, he turns him into a beast. You let you be a beast for a little bit, because you got to figure out your spot. Alan, you want to ask a question?
Yes, when Daniel approaches him and said, renounce your sin and stop doing wickedness, was there a concept that Nebuchadnezzar could actually go on?
You mean
Did he know
about
what that meant?
what sin is and what it is not? I think that's what part of the 40 years has been. I mean, look, remember that if you go back to day one with these guys, they're asking, can we not eat that king's food? And there's things that they are following their God. And Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges it. You guys have said you're not going to listen to what I'm asking. You're going to follow your God. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, he says it all. You decided not to do what I told you you had to do. You were going to be faithful servants to your God. He had information. If he had wanted to seek God, right, he had the ability to go there and ask the question. What would I do to satisfy your God? Is a simple question.
But he doesn't even ask what sin.
Why not? I know.
In verse 29, it says at the end of 12 months, he walked into the palace of the king of Babylon. So did God give him a whole year to repent?
Yeah, or at the end of the year. I'm not exactly sure exactly, but it seems like it could be that it was a year yet, or at the end of that year, at the end of those 12 months. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, but either way, he gave him a period of time to let the words sink in and to change his course. Right? But he did not. Maggie.
In verse 27, it says that break off thy sins by righteousness and thy iniquities by showing mercy to the poor.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they were abusing the poor for the building of this city.
But yeah, either way, he was not merciful.
Right.
I'll talk about merciful a little bit, just because of the setting of it. You can't be merciful unless you're in power. It's impossible. You have the authority or the jurisdiction or the right, if you would.
Resources.
You can impose, what's that?
Resources.
And the resources, yes, because they have to be there, and the resources to execute judgment. And that judgment it is absolutely within your rights, if it's in your power. A judge has the authority to throw the book at somebody. Brian?
So if we're looking for some definitions of sin, but just that last line, being kind to the poor, that talks about the heart,
Yeah.
which is
Yep, exactly.
the biggest thing.
That's right, because so now, in a man that is in a position of high authority, right? Let alone this man who is in the highest. If on the earth, he's in the highest spot. And you are not exercising mercy. That in order for mercy to have its work, right, there has to be a compassion to the soul that you are looking at and you want to execute judgment on, or whatever, or have the authority over. So even though the law says I can throw you in prison for the rest of your life, I can be merciful, I'm going to give you 20 years. That means that you should be, even if you get out at 70, you should be able to live a couple outside, right? That's merciful, right? There is but you can only do that if you are in a position. And this is part of what is being told to him. You're supposed to rethink how you think of yourself. You're using your power for evil, right? And to be malicious, if you would. You should be using it to be merciful.
No.
And we're pushing up against the clock here a little bit. But let's go, what verse are we at here? So, 32?
No.
Well, okay, verse 30 again. King spoke is not this great Babylon that I have built for the kingdom of my, and by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty. All three are wrong, right? But if you want to make a little note for yourself, this verse and what it speaks, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, for the honor of my majesty. This is your flesh. This is what your flesh thinks of yourself. If you ever want to have a clear idea of how your flesh thinks, this is what it thinks. How do I know that? If you give any man absolute power, right? Absolute corruption will work itself out because of the absolute sinful nature of the flesh. The man is inherently evil, not good. This is the flip of what the liberal thinking, right, versus what we would call conservative thinking. But biblical thinking says man inherently evil. If ye, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your kids, who said that? Right? He doesn't mince words. He knows it. But this is what happens. So now, here's the thing. Any power you have, if you give it to the flesh, it goes there. So do you have any power as a parent? Yeah. Well, you can abuse it. Do you have any power as a husband? Yeah. You can abuse it. Do you have any power as a wife? Yes. You can abuse it. Any human being in any, do you have any power when you're in grade 3? Well, yeah, over the guys that are smaller. Right? It's called bullying. Right? Well, do you know what Nebuchadnezzar is? He's a bully. He's a big bully. And he happens to have the whole world as a classroom. He's at the top of the hill. Right? King of the hill. You ever play that game? We always had John. We didn't even know John Mead that lived at the corner of, he was in our grade because he had moved from South America and they put him 2 grades down, but he was 8 feet tall. He was 8 feet tall in grade 6.
That his driver's license?
And he has a driver's license. No, but he always came to school with his work boots on, steel-toed work boots. So if you could choose him for your soccer team, you did. He was the first one chosen because he could literally kick it from our goal all the way to that goal in one fell swoop. Boom. And when you played King of the Hill, you wanted him on your team because all you did is stand behind him. Throw him out. I like it. He wasn't a bully in any sense. He just did what we asked him to. We were the bullies. Yeah, exactly. While the word was yet in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee." Boom. God can change your circumstance any second, in a split second that he wants to change it. Beautiful thing is he can change it for good as well, but he can do this. He can change your world in a split second, and he can move it around, and now it's going to go in a different direction. And it is. Verse 32, "And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee eat grass, until 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High." Why? Here's the purpose. There's a purpose. What's God's ultimate purpose? To get everybody into glory with him when we die, right? And he has to do a miracle to do it. He has to change sinners into not sinners. His big trouble is getting you to believe that you're a sinner. He's trying to teach Nebuchadnezzar he's a sinner. He's not getting it. He's given him 40 years that I can see to try to figure it out, and he is not there. Why would it be important to get Nebuchadnezzar to see it? Well, wouldn't this do an amazing thing? Who did he write this letter to? Watch what's happening here. Who did he write this letter to? The whole world. Do you know who these guys were supposed to speak to? The whole world. Do you know that there's a reason that God shows that he can talk through a jackass in the Bible? He can also speak through a man like Nebuchadnezzar, who is of the world to the nth degree. He runs the whole show from a secular, where he believes in all sorts of gods, and you know what he's going to do? He's going to write a letter now to the whole world and say, if you want my advice, go with the real guy. That's what he's doing in Daniel chapter 4. God is doing that with an unsaved man. Right? He starts off, where did the guy end up? Like I said before, I think he changed his heart. But he's coming here, and he says they'll drive thee. So the same hour was the thing fulfilled. We're right at the end, sorry. All his days and all that. Verse 37. Let's just wrap this up here. Now, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Boom. To the whole world. He wrote that, right? All the inhabitants. Chapter 5, last we hear of Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, here. Timeline goes on, Belshazzar is next, right? What a way to write a letter. Okay, Heavenly Father, thank you for the beauty of what you did in history. It's just unbelievable, and you are doing it out of mercy, the opposite of what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. We praise you for that. Thank you for sending your gospel mercifully to us. Thank you, God, that you drew us and that we had the ability even to say yes to you. Praise you for all that. Bless the remainder of this morning service. In Jesus' name, amen.